Hello and welcome to another one of our videos on the Scottish Wars of Independence. This video deals with the events of the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, specifically day 1 of the battle. The aim of this video then today is to learn how the opposing forces compared at the Battle of Bannockburn. By the end of the video we should be able to describe the differences in the opposing forces, be able to explain why the English army was so poorly prepared for the battle, and be able to explain conversely why the Scottish army was such an effective fighting force by 1314. As this is a series of videos aimed at students of higher history, although accessible to anyone, students of higher history are encouraged to take notes as they go through the video, recording information that appears in bold. There will also be a focus on the battlefield and the events that unfurl on the battle today, so we would encourage you to annotate your own copy of the battlefield map to build a diagram of what unfolded in the first day of the battle. So to begin with, a recap of what Bruce has been up to get him on the road to the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Having dealt with the Common family and his rivals within the Kingdom of Scotland, Bruce was able to turn his attention to removing the English-held garrisons from his kingdom. So after the Parliament of St Andrews in 1309, Bruce turned his attentions to Lothian. And this southeastern corner of Scotland was an English-held stronghold at this time. Bruce employed guerrilla tactics to hide the English-held lands and garrisons of this area. Now this caused such turmoil for these garrisons that they wrote to Edward II for help, and their king answered. He came with an army of 4,700 men. Now that is pretty small for an English invasion of Scotland at this time, especially one led by the king. The reason for this is Edward was in dispute with his barons, and very few sent men to actually help and take part in this force. A lot of them paid something called scutage, where they sent money and mercenaries instead of sending their own men, or they sent the fewest men that they were legally bound to do so. This meant Edward's army was quite underpowered. He was about similar in strength with Bruce's army. However, Bruce was still shy of meeting the English in a pitched engagement in the field, having experienced defeats at places like Methven Wood in 1306. So he avoided that battle, and Edward was left frustrated. So in 1310, Edward made a few expeditions into Lothian, but Bruce refused to face him in open battle, and with his supply lanes exposed, Edward was forced to withdraw, frustrated, to winter his forces in Berwick. Now, with no victory or plunder to speak of, Edward ran out of funds by mid-1311, and that forced him to abandon his campaign. He wouldn't return to Scotland for a further 3 years. This gave Bruce a free hand to raid and ravage Lothian for the next 3 years, and he extorted £20,000 in money, corn and cattle from the region, which was a king's ransom by then. So with Edward gone, Bruce's forces were free to pick off other English-held garrisons around Scotland. In 1311, he moved against Dumbarton Castle, which gave him control of the Firth of Clyde. In 1312, his forces took the walled city of Perth by surprise in a night attack. Now, this becomes a reoccurring phenomenon with Bruce's campaigns against English. He lacks the strength to conduct an open siege and attack these walled cities and powerful castles head on, so we often hear of Bruce using cunning and guile to get his men in instead, and by he is largely successful in these operations. In 1313, Bruce's success continued. His forces took Dumfries in the southwest corner of Scotland and were then able to subjugate the region of Galloway around it. After that, his forces took to the ships and they sailed out into the Irish Sea and captured the Isle of Man, which was an important strategic stronghold. In September 1313, Bruce's successes continued, and we hear of his forces scoring the famous victory of managing to jam a hay wagon in the gateway of Linlithgow Castle, allowing his own men to rush in and overwhelm the garrison. Now, this high point in Bruce's achievements so far gave him the confidence to issue a proclamation. He told the Lords of Scotland, those who were still loyal to Edward and not him, they had 1 year to come across to his side and swear fealty to him, lest they risk forfeiting for life their lands and their titles. Now, this caused these lords to write a letter to Edward II in alarm, asking for help. Edward II promised to answer, saying that he would come with an army in midsummer 1314 to their aid. Now, this gave the Bruce 9 months to get ready, which he used to take the major strongholds in southeast Scotland of Roxburgh and Edinburgh, both by surprise, denying Edward vital bases for supplies in his coming march north. So this set the stage for the events of the summer of 1314, which sees the two armies clash on the field at Bannockburn. The road to battle. Now this is it. This is Deer Street, the old Roman road that connects York to Edinburgh. And for centuries, invading armies coming into the Kingdom of Scotland would have followed this track. Edward's army in 1314 would have followed this road, then known as the King's Road, when they made their way into Scotland. Now, as part of Robert the Bruce's campaign to conquer Scotland and remove English garrisons, in March of 1314, his younger brother Edward Bruce had laid siege to Stirling Castle. Now, this gave Edward II a focus for his invasion path. In midsummer 1314, when he would arrive 3 months later, the relief of Stirling Castle was to be his immediate goal. Now, Edward Bruce's siege of Stirling Castle was disrupted by the oncoming English invasion, and Edward the Bruce had made a deal with the garrison commander, Sir Philip Mowbray, that if Edward had not arrived by midsummer 1314, the English garrison commander would surrender the castle and the city to Edward. In return, Edward Bruce would not press his assault and would not directly attack the city. Therefore, both sides preserved life and basically sat on their hands and waited until the wider situation could evolve. It was in Edward II's interest to get to Stirling then by Midsummer's Day to preserve this essential outpost that he still held on to in the Kingdom of Scotland. It is clear, however, from the size of the English army and from the language he used in his writs to summon his troops, that Edward's real purpose, however, was to put down the wider rebellion of Bruce across Scotland. He wasn't just after saving Stirling, he wanted to end the Bruce. So Edward had force marched his army up the old Roman road north from Berwick to make Stirling before the deadline. Bruce had been waiting outside Falkirk. At the English approach, he retreated north to Bannockburn to consider his options. Now, Bruce is on dangerous ground here. He is literally following in the footsteps of Wallace in 1298 at the Battle of Falkirk. Wallace also had waited before the English approach just outside of Falkirk and considered his options, and he made his stand there. Bruce is not going to fall into the same trap, however. Now, much of what we know of the battle comes from Barber's poem The Bruce, written 60 years after the battle. The historians have tried to work out the size of the forces involved, the deployment, and their composition ever since. Professor Barrow's extensive research into the battle has produced the agreed strengths that we're about to see. So starting with the English army. Edward had ordered an army to be levied, which would assemble at Wark-on-Tweed by the 10th of June 1314. Wark-on-Tweed was an English castle or border stronghold right on the border between England and Scotland. The English force was to include 2,000 mounted knights and men-at-arms. Now, this number may have included as few as 800 knights, with the rest being made up of mercenary forces and mounted men-at-arms. The bulk of the English army, however, was going to be made up of foot soldiers, between 10,000 and 21,000 men, depending on which sources we use. We do know that after his campaign of 1310 and 1311, when his army had been just so small, Edward was concerned about his numbers. For the 1310-11 campaign, he'd received only half the number of men he'd actually summoned from the feudal levies. But in 1310, Edward's barons had not been behind him, and he sent the minimum number of men necessary to meet the feudal demands. This time round, however, the English barons, on the whole, have fallen into line behind their king, and we see his army numbers swell. The Earl of Ulster would took part in the battle, and he would have brought a contingent of Irish spearmen with him as well. It's uncertain, however, if some or any of the 25 Irish chieftains summoned actually came and answered Edward's call as well. Now, Edward's army only set out from Wark on the 17th of June. But bear in mind, he was supposed to be at Stirling by Midsummer's Day. He had to force march them to get them from the border to Stirling in time. So they moved at pace with little time for meals or rest for sleep. Now, Roger Mortimer, one of the English marcher lords in charge of the occupation of Wales, raised 3,000 Welsh infantry for the campaign. Modern historians think about 1,000 of these were lombowmen. Now, the longbow is one of the deadliest weapons on the medieval battlefield. That bow could fire an arrow with enough force to punch through plate armour. It's the reason that England was so dominant during the period of the 100 Years' War with France, as their longbowmen and archers were able to decimate the French knights on the battlefield. But to bring fearsome soldiers like this to the medieval battlefield in Scotland must have presented quite a dilemma for Bruce. How would he deal with these forces? One of our sources, Barber, wrote that the English army contained French infantry, German knights, and Irish levies serving as mercenaries, but it is likely that their numbers were comparatively small. The forces available to the king varied in quality and for the most part probably resented taking part in a campaign. They were forced to be here. On paper, however, their numbers and their weapons look formidable. Edward is coming with a large force, with armoured knights, and hundreds, if not over 1,000, deadly longbowmen. The English army was to be split into 3 massive divisions. We had the vanguard, the front, the midguard, and the rearguard. Each had roughly equal numbers of foot soldiers, archers, and knights. The Constable of England, the Earl of Hereford, had the job of organising the divisions and making sure they were ready to fight. This man was a veteran of the campaigns of Edward I, and he knew what he was doing. Each division was split into a brigade of 1,000 men, led by a senior noble. The lines of command within the English army seem to have been blurred at Bannockburn, and this is one of the problems that plagued them throughout the battle. Edward II decided not to take command in person, which is a bizarre choice for a king on the battlefield. He chose instead to fight as an ordinary knight. He also appointed his nephew, the young Earl of Gloucester, to command the vanguard instead of the Constable of England, the veteran Earl of Hereford, causing resentment and offence. Edward appointed favourites to key command positions in the army, ignoring more experienced nobles. As the battle unfolded, the chain of command became unclear, and the leaders bickered amongst themselves over what to do. This would handicap the English across both days of the battle. Now, in contrast, let's see what the Scottish army had to bring to the battlefield. Bruce's army numbered around 5,000 to 7,000 men. The Scottish population and economy at the time would not support a much larger force. Bruce's army was divided up into 3 brigades of 1,500 spearmen. These would form schiltrums during the battle. A schiltrum is an infantry formation where a large brigade of spearmen typically form an oval or circular formation with the spears pointing outwards. This hedgehog-like effect is meant to drive off enemy cavalry, as horses will not charge onto a wall of spikes because they have some sense. This is usually the only protection for infantry or foot-based soldiers against the power of a cavalry charge. Robert Bruce commanded one of these schiltrums, while the others were led by Edward Bruce, his remaining brother, and the Lord Thomas Randolph. Bruce also had around 500 cavalry of his own, led by Sir Robert Keith. Unlike the English, these are not equipped for charging the enemy lines. They are not heavy shock troops. Their role in the battle would instead be to protect the flanks of the schiltrums from cavalry charges and from the English archers. The role of James Douglas made famous by Netflix's Outlaw King movie, is a confusing one in the battle. It's possible that he commanded a fourth schiltrom, but more likely he had a contingent of his own men under the command overall of Edward Bruce, tasked with defending the flanks of the main schiltroms. So he would have been a kind of rapid reaction force moving quickly around the battlefield to plug any gaps that showed up. Now, the Scots would have had a few archers to draw upon of their own, but they did not have longbows. They were used between the schiltrom formations to protect the spearmen from enemy cavalry flanking them. So they were meant to fend off enemy attacks that are trying to skirt round the Scottish infantry and stop them coming at the Scottish sides and rear. The Bruce also had up to 2,000 small folk in reserve. Now, these are not people who lack in height. These are people who are not professional soldiers. They're made up of amateurs and camp followers who are also keen to lend their support and join in the fight. Bruce would have been wary to put these people into the battle, however, as their lack of discipline could potentially create a disaster which would affect the rest of his army. So these small folk were to be used as an emergency reserve only and held well back. Now, the core of Bruce's army were experienced and they'd fought together for 7 years, usually getting the best of any fighting. If you remember from our previous videos, since the terrible year of 1306 where everything seemed to go against him, when Bruce made his comeback from early 1307, most engagements and battles that he got himself into, he had eventually emerged as the victor. And these men, this army that he has built around him, have been on that path with him. So they've spent a long time fighting together, building experience, building discipline. Bruce had developed a reputation across Europe during this time for being an excellent war leader. Psychologically as well, it's important to remember it had been a long time since the Scots had known defeat. Unlike Edward's force-marched army, they'd also had months to prepare for the battle. His men are rested, and they know what they are doing. Unlike the English chain of command, everyone in the Scottish army knew their job. Most knights and nobles fought on foot in the front ranks of the schiltroms, providing focus to lead the common soldiers and urge them forwards. It's also important to remember that the knights and the nobles would have had the best armour and equipment as well. Putting these men at the front of the fighting formation means that you have soldiers who are more likely to survive the crush of hand-to-hand combat and lend real staying power to the Scottish formation. Now, having looked at the two armies that are going to be involved in the fight, let's now turn to look at the battlefield that they would clash on, Bannockburn itself. Now, historians are unsure if Bruce intended to actually fight Edward when he appeared. It's probable that Bruce wanted to survey Edward's layout and strength before committing to a battle, as only seems sense. Nevertheless, Bruce was determined to make the terrain work to his advantage. He'd chosen the site of the battlefield and he'd prepared the ground to support his army if battle was joined. At this point, modern historians believe that Bruce was in no way 100% committed to actually fighting this battle. Now, this map shows the layout of the battlefield at Bannockburn. Bruce chose the King's Park to make his stand. It's a royal hunting ground south of Stirling on the road to the city. As you can see on this map, there are two faint lines of roads that converge at St Ninians and work their way up to Stirling Castle. You can see the meandering track of the River Forth up on the top right corner of the map. The paler area around the Carse and around the River Forth is low-lying, very boggy ground, and then the darker shaded land in the King's Park out towards the New Park Forest, the Gillies Hill and the western stretches of the Bannockburn. It's higher ground which would have been drier and much better for our armies to meet on to fight. The battle site offered a raised, open field surrounded on three sides by either the Pell Stream to the right or the deep gully of the Bannockburn to the bottom and to the left. So Bruce is choosing ground to contain the forces and basically to try and negate the massive numerical advantage of the English. The Pell Stream sat in a gully just like the Bannockburn, and it was choked out with dense gorse and undergrowth. It would be a difficult obstacle to infantry and cavalry alike to try and cross. The lower land of the Bannockburn was a sodden marsh. This is the land just to the east, where we see the Carse marked on our map. And it was a sodden marsh called the Carse of Balquidder. The remaining side of the King's Park was bounded by wooded hills, and both roads to Stirling crossed the Bannockburn via bridges before hugging the tree line on the route to Stirling itself. Now, unlike Wallace, Bruce did not dig his men in behind barriers and take up a static position. Once you do that, you give the tactical advantage to your enemy because you need to cling to that defensive position in order to enjoy its benefits. Bruce is not going to fall into that trap, so he opts for a more subtle plan. Bruce positions his men on the wooded hill of the King's Park to shelter them from English archers and the eyes of Edward's scouts. If the Scots are hiding in the trees, Edward's not going to know their true strength, and neither can he just sit back and pummel them with his arrows, as Edward I did to Wallace at Falkirk. Now, on the high ground around the roads crossing the King's Park, on the northern side of the Bannockburn, Bruce ordered pit traps called pots to be dug. The purpose of these was to snap the legs of horses. If a horse is galloping along towards its enemy and it throws a leg down one of these pot traps, its momentum is probably going to snap the leg of the horse, bringing the horse and the rider down, taking them out of the fight and potentially tripping any fast-moving riders immediately following along behind them. Quite a horrible, nasty trap. Some historians suggest that these were traps for Edward's cavalry. This, however, seems too obvious. By making the pots visible, it's thought that Bruce was actually encouraging Edward to look for a different approach to cross the Bannockburn, one which the Bruce would far prefer. So Bruce, it seems possibly, didn't actually ever intend Edward's horses to fall into these traps. He's just trying to redirect the path of the larger English force. So, to begin the battle itself, day 1 occurs on the 23rd of June 1314. Now, students of higher history may wish to annotate a copy of the map so they can build up a diagram of what's going to happen over day 1 and day 2 of the battle. This section of the video will help them achieve this. So to do so, if you take a diagram of the map and use 2 different colours to annotate it to represent the 2 different armies that we are going to see play out across our battlefield. We'll annotate the map as the story unfolds in the next section of the video. So, students of higher history may wish to annotate their maps with the following setup for the battle. And also, it would be a good idea to take down a key for your map, as shown here. So how is the battlefield set up? First of all, we can see the pits, or the pot traps, that Bruce put around the roads approaching Stirling, down as they made their crossing over the Bannockburn. This is, if you remember, to direct Edward's forces to try and force them to avoid the road and use a different way to cross into the King's Park that would play into Bruce's favour. Now, Bruce set his forces up as follows. The small folk, the camp followers, the eager amateurs who wanted to join in and do their bit for their king and their kingdom, they were held far at the back in the Scots camp, at the back of the King's Park. We see Moray Sheltram is based at St Ninians to try and halt any English forces getting up that road towards Stirling and making it through to disrupt the siege of the town. Sir Robert Keith and Sir James Douglas, Scotland's rapid reaction force during this battle, are held just behind Coxet Hill, where they can rush out and deal with any developing situations. Edward Bruce has a shelter of soldiers hidden in the new park, away from prying English eyes and English arrows, as does Bruce himself. When we join the battle, Bruce is actually not with his sheltrum. He is out on horseback in his royal livery, directing forces and organising his army in where they should be. He is separate from his infantry. He is exposed. So how does it start to unfold? The students of higher history might also want to take down notes of the different steps shown here of the battle, so they have a clear understanding in the diagram of what goes down. So on Sunday the 23rd of June 1314, Bruce had sent out Douglas and Keith with some horsemen to scout out the English advance. Where were the English? In the late afternoon, Douglas and Keith found the English army marching in 3 large divisions along the road from Falkirk. And annotate your maps as follows to add the 3 divisions in. The vanguard at the front, the midguard, and the rear guard. 3 massive battalions coming up the road. Now, the English army approached in disarray. This is a fast march, and his soldiers would have been knackered after a day's marching. Edward was unsure whether or not to engage the Scots that day. The medieval armies, as a general rule, do not fight later on in the day if they encounter each other, say in the afternoon or a bit later on into the evening. The reason for that is that risks the battle spilling on into nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, medieval soldiers could not see who's who, and you risk the disaster of your own soldiers killing your own men. So to avoid that, they usually, if they encountered each other in the afternoon or later, they would halt, and then the 2 armies would break out into a camp, and then at dawn, the adversaries would line up for a fight with plenty of hours of daylight in hand to see things through. Edward arrives by all accounts late in the afternoon, and he doesn't have the luxury of lots of time. Also, having done a forced march for a day, his army is probably quite knackered. But something happens to force his hand. Out of reach of orders from their king, in the vanguard, the Earls Gloucester and Hereford chased the Scottish scouts through the Torwood. Emerging from the trees, they could see Scottish soldiers scattered across the King's Park on the other side of the Bannockburn. It looked like the Scots were withdrawing. Impatiently, young knights charged across the Bannockburn and up the hill towards enemy lines, by all accounts avoiding Bruce's pot traps just around the roads. Now, students of higher history who are going through this video, it should be annotating their maps as this unfolds. So if you show the knights of the English vanguard snaking their way towards the very exposed looking Robert the Bruce sitting out there in the field on his horse. And here we are. There is the son of the Earl of Hereford and his knights heading off to try and nobble the Scottish king. Meanwhile, Edward ordered another cavalry unit under Sir Robert de Clifford to scout the edge of the Carse, that bog over there to the east, and try to force a way through and relieve the garrison at Stirling. So Edward's actually making quite a sensible decision here. The point of his army getting to Stirling in such a rush is to relieve the Scottish siege of his northern stronghold. So if Robert the Bruce and the Scots are distracted by the charge of these foolhardy young knights, then Edward can take advantage of that and sneak some of his forces through to relieve the city. So if you add this to your maps, this is Robert Clifford's cavalry force sneaking their way around the edge of the battlefield to try and get past St Ninians and on to Stirling. So Hereford and his force of about 300 knights crossed the King's Park at speed and came across Robert the Bruce alone, inspecting his troops. Now, Hereford's nephew, Henry de Bohun, saw his chance for glory. Without waiting for orders, he lowered his lance and charged across the battlefield at King Robert. Now, Robert the Bruce was not prepared for open battle at that point. By accounts, he was not on his main steed. A war horse in medieval warfare is a prized possession. It is a big, bulky, massively muscled beast that's been raised and bred to fight in war and deal with all the clamour, the noise and the horror of hand-to-hand combat with knights. You don't want to wear it out by just noodling around on that horse for hours before going into battle on it. So what Robert would have been on would have been his second horse. It wouldn't have been a war horse, that would have been a riding horse, and it probably would have been smaller than the chargers of the knights. So when de Bohun bears down on him, Riding his massive warhorse, Bruce is on a shorter horse and he's lower down. Bruce is also stationary. He had a choice of what to do. Exposed as he was, away from his men, out on an open battlefield, Bruce could either have fled back to the trees to the safety of his own men. However, you need to think about the psychological impact that would have had on his army and on the army of the English as well. Seeing a king leg it at full speed away from the enemy does not instill pride, does not instill courage in the wider Scottish army. Alternatively, if Bruce stayed to fight, he's on a smaller horse, he doesn't have a lance, he's only got his axe with him, so he's not as well equipped as the English knight bearing down on him. How is he going to meet this man face to face? Now the answer came like this. Alone and armed only with a battle axe, rather than run, Bruce calmly waited for de Bohun's charge. Now this is an extremely brave and courageous move by the Scottish king and speaks of his courage. At the last moment, Bruce had his small horse sidestep de Bohun's charge. Standing up in his stirrups, because if you remember, his horse is going to be smaller than the charger of the English knight, Bruce brought his axe down on de Bohun's head, almost splitting it in two. Apparently the force of the blow shattered the haft of Bruce's axe. So Bruce, cool as a cucumber, was able to sidestep the headlong charge of the English knight, who would have been travelling at something approaching 40 miles an hour. And with all that momentum on him, when Bruce stepped out of the way, de Bohun could not alter his charge, and as he thundered on past, Bruce stood in his stirrups to get above the English knight and hammered his axe down on the knight's head as he sailed on past. You can imagine why de Bohun did this charge. The chance to kill the King of Scots himself in one-on-one combat was not a feat of chivalry that came often to any knight in the land. The young de Bohun must have been dazzled by the opportunity for glory. Now, de Bohun crumpled into the dirt. Bruce had killed him in single combat. Bruce's schiltrom cheered from the forest and then charged out to meet English cavalry and support their king. You can imagine the buzz that must have been rippling through the Scottish ranks. Now, this was no minor skirmish. The Earl of Gloucester, at the fore of the fighting, was then knocked from his horse. The English knights suffered significant casualties and they retreated south of the Bannockburn. Robert Keith's horsemen advanced on and chased them off. There you go. Students of higher history should be annotating their maps to show how this stage of the battle is unfolding. So the first move by the English has been repulsed. Bruce has been faced in single combat and survived. Would have been phenomenal for the morale of the Scottish army and would have been quite unsettling for the English army to have seen. However, while this plays out over to the left side of our battlefield, towards the centre of the battlefield, something else is going on with Robert Clifford and his advance towards the city. So meanwhile, Clifford's force had made its way around the pot traps and through the Carse. Bruce had stationed Moray's men at St Ninian's Kirk to stop such a move. His attention elsewhere, Moray was slow to respond. Hastily, he formed a schiltrom on the open plain to block Clifford's path. Now, the historian Barrow has Randolph, Earl of Moray, actually with Bruce during that first engagement, where he should not have been. When Bruce realised that Clifford was trying to skirt round the flank of his army, he gave Randolph a sharp rebuke and sent him sharply on his way to block the threat. Randolph's oversight was serious. It could have cost the Scots the entire battle. If his men had allowed Clifford to get through, then English forces could have come down, sweeping out of Stirling Castle along with Clifford's men to attack Bruce's army from rear and catch him in a pincer manoeuvre, which would have been a disaster. Now, when English cavalry under Clifford saw Moray's men preparing for battle, as their commander legged it down from Bruce, an argument broke out amongst the senior knights. This was symptomatic of the poor command amongst Edward's army during the battle. So Thomas Grey, an ageing and experienced knight, urged them to attack immediately before Moray's schiltrom was ready. Sir Henry Beaumont, however, argued that Clifford should wait so that more Scots might appear and their anticipated victory over them might seem all the more impressive. Angered at Beaumont's stupidity, Sir Thomas Grey charged the Scottish pikemen by himself. Clifford and the rest immediately followed, but they couldn't get past the Shiltram spears. Knights apparently even resorted to throwing their lances and swords at the Scots to try and kill them, but to no avail. Unlike Falkirk, at this point the English had no archers to hand. They're still making their way up the road to soften up the Scottish Shiltram. Likewise, the discipline of Moray's men was excellent. Remember, these guys have been with Bruce for 7 years now. They know what they're doing. So Moray's spearmen aimed for Clifford's horses as much as the knights, and it's likely that many of his men were unhorsed. So Clifford's men could not get past the bristling spears, and eventually the English morale broke, and Clifford's men fled back to their lines. Edward's gambit of trying to get around to Stirling behind Bruce's back had failed. The Moray's men fought off a charge of heavy cavalry. They suffered a few losses of their own, and they'd also successfully blocked the route to Stirling Castle. With Hereford and Clifford returning to the main lines, it was too late for further fighting that day. In the English camp, the news of the defeat was not received well. The men had marched all day, and they were hot and exhausted. Morale would have suffered as the night wore on, and the tales of the defeat were shared and repeated around the campfires. English knights had been humiliated by what they regarded as a band of ill-bred peasants. This would perhaps explain their rash actions on the following day of the battle. The English army camped for the night to the east of the Roman road, with many crossing the Bannockburn to sleep on a patch of raised ground above the Carse. Now remember, the Carse itself is a bog. By planting all those traps around the Roman roads and denying the English access to the King's Park to the north of the Bannockburn, Bruce has forced the English army to camp on what they thought was an open field next to the Bannockburn stream to the east of it. However, that open field turned out to be a squishy bog. So those 20,000 men marching up the road from Edinburgh were forced to spend the night cold, wet, probably quite miserable, anticipating a battle to come the next day. The chances of rest would have been fairly minimal. Bruce's aggression had also shocked the English army, and they now believed that a night attack was possible. Proper sleep, even if you were able to get it in a bog, would now be out of question for the men. This is not going to set them up well for the day of battle to come. That night, the Scots were still debating over whether to withdraw. Now, that may seem surprising, even shocking to us with hindsight, but bear in mind that Bruce's army is still outnumbered 4-1 by this English force. Bruce has recorded something of a victory, perhaps, but he would have been very, very much aware of the size of the forces arrayed against him that would have taken that battlefield on the next day, and reticent as well to see a repeat of the disasters he experienced in 1306. Bruce had been very, very careful about whether or not to engage this English force the following day. So Bruce's inclination was to stick to the guerrilla warfare that he knew and did well at, and to avoid large set battles. The instinct to leave must have almost been overpowering. During the night, however, a Scottish knight, Sir Alexander Seaton, defected from the English camp, bringing word of their low morale. Now he said, "My Lord King, now is the time if you ever mean to win Scotland. The English have lost heart, they are discomfited, and they expect nothing but a sudden and open attack. I swear on my head and on pain of being hanged and drawn that if you attack them in the morning, you will defeat them easily, without loss." So that's it for this video today, guys. Thanks very much for listening. The next video will look at the events of day 2 of the Battle of Bannockburn, and we will learn how the final stages of this epic conflict unfolded. See you next time.